I am Kim Klett, the Deputy Executive Director for the Educators Institute for Human Rights. At EIHR, we cultivate partnerships among educators globally to create materials and deliver training based on best practices in Holocaust education. Together, we deliver content and strategies for teaching mass atrocities history, genocide prevention, and sustainable peace. Today's webinar is one in a series entitled Human Rights Education in Everyday Classrooms, Why and How, created by our education coordinator in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Alma Gero. Between now and December, we will conduct webinars focusing on human rights education, utilizing language arts and performing arts, along with topics on memorializing and the culture of remembrance. Please watch for announcements with the dates for these, and those of you joining us today will receive personal invitations. For today's program, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box, and we will try to get to them after everyone has spoken. I would like to start by introducing today's panelists, who come from 4 of the continents and represent exactly what EIHR does. Joining us from Argentina is Alicia Edith Hibaldo, a professor for primary education. She has been teaching for 30 years and currently teaches in Domingo Faustino Sarmiento Primary School, located in Jovita, a small town from the province of Cordoba, Argentina. She is focused on literature and natural sciences. Also from Argentina, and Alicia's daughter, is Antonella Giordano. She is a licenciate in international relations and has her master's in peace culture, conflicts, education, and human rights. Antonella works on institutional development at the Center for Legal and Social Studies. She's a current member of the Observatory of Argentinian Foreign Policy, and she develops educational materials for Argentina at EIHR. Joining us from Rwanda is Albert Rutikanga, a professional and passionate educator in peace education, genocide studies, and human rights education. He is the founder and executive director of the Peace Education Initiative Rwanda, which is engaged in healing wounds caused by the 1994 genocide of Tutsi in Rwanda. Next is EIHR's Director of Education in Rwanda, Amabla Mpayimana. In addition to his BA in Education and MA in Development Studies, Amabla has studied the Holocaust extensively, earning a certificate in Holocaust education from Trinity College in Dublin. In Rwanda, he leads our partnership with the Anne Frank House, Amsterdam, and is the founder of Hope of Family, a local NGO working with low-income families in rural Rwanda. Joining us today from Bosnia and Herzegovina is our friend Olivera Nedic, civic education and geography teacher, Savita's network coordinator, trainer and expert for systematic approach and strategies in development of HR within the education system. In her activism, she is focused on demography policies, education, peace building, and gender issues. Her MS is in strategic management from ECPD, University of UN, Belgrade. Olivera's bachelor's is in geography and ethnology at Faculty of Science, University of Banja Luka. Joining us from the US is EIHR board member Thea McFawn, a school administrator in upstate New York. She spent the first 16 years of her career as a high school English teacher. In addition to her work in public education, Thea leads the Capital Region Institute for Human Rights, which hosts human rights conferences for teenagers. And last but not least, Britta Bostad is joining us from North Dakota, where she teaches language arts. Excuse me. Her primary teaching experience has been with high school new Americans and mainstream middle school learners. Britta has her EL endorsement, a master's in curriculum and instruction, and is a national board certified English teacher. She was also a 2017 USHMM Museum Teacher Fellow and a member of the 2019 Tolly cohort in New York City. So we are going to pose our first question to the panelists today, and that is, what does human rights education look like in your classroom. And so I think we'll go to our friends in Rwanda first. And Amabla and Albert, I'll start with the two of you. Amabla, if you want to start, and then we'll take it to Albert.
Yeah, sure. First and foremost, I will say that human rights here in Rwanda is taught in two ways. First, human rights is taught as cross-cutting and in different subjects. It is required that teachers have to see how to bring up concept of human rights, because one of the values of the national curriculum is very clear. It is stated that curriculum has to enforce the respect of others and human rights as well. Secondly, human rights is taught as compulsory subjects. As compulsory topics, especially to high schools. Those students doing history subjects, there is a technical content of human rights they have to cover. For instance, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, international human rights instruments, those kind of technical stuff pertaining to human rights. So for me, I was teaching human rights as part of cross-cutting because I was communication and leadership course teacher. So I'm very glad because the time when I was teaching communication while bringing in human rights, I was teaching teenager students who became orphans simply because human rights were violated. Black is talking about genocide. So throughout that, I was asking myself, what type of education I have to offer to my students? Because basically genocide was planned by people who had gone to school, but eventually missed a minimum level of understanding and ethics. So education was really imperative at my side to all the time ask myself what I have to do as a teacher, what kind of tool I have to be using such that I impart in my students these positive values. So I'm glad because I was able to adapt different lessons, collecting different resources from here and there. Students learned communication skills, but at the same time, learning some principles of human rights. My pedagogy was very engaging, and I was very glad to see how students changed their attitudes, but most importantly, they became protectors of their own rights and their peers as well. They were able to set up, some smaller tasks in their own communities, but in totality, which really made a huge impact. So I would say teaching human rights in my class was a really enjoyable experience, and I was very glad to be part of, this great network of professionals doing smaller acts, but in totality, having a huge impact on these students, on their future.
Thank you so much. And how about you, Albert? Same question.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Kim, for giving us this time to be part of this wonderful panel. From our experience, while teaching human rights to people, it's like opening doors to them for more opportunities. I say this because some people live in the dark without recognizing their value, what they are allowed and what their obligation. With the knowledge we give them, it enables them to resolve some conflict that they have with their fellow and live in harmony. In addition, human rights education provides a basic for conflict resolution and a promotion of social order based on our past 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. In addition to that, it's a value system based on respect and equality and dignity to all people. Humanity can create a basic organizing and resolving such difference. People need to be able to think critically, make moral choice, take a principled position on issue, and our students are applying, analyzing, evaluating, and are creating, dealing a significant portion of lesson. Let us come back for here, for instance, for Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 2, freedom of discrimination. Discrimination has led to genocide, and it is important to teach a student to understand the danger of this in order to try their best and work for society where everybody is treated with respect. For instance, here in most cases, and one actually, we try to to teach and make training different clubs with the Peace Education Center Rwanda, to offering training in genocide prevention, the danger of hatred, which will equip younger generation to be peacemakers, to be human defenders, to avoid any kind of hatred which can bring to genocide. As you know, Rwanda, we experienced it to genocide against the Tutsis. It's very important, it's very crucial to equip younger generation, post-younger generation to develop critical thinking and to be humanity defenders. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Antonella, could we go to you and Alicia next, please?
Yes, so I will be doing some translation in parallel to my mom. She will speak in Spanish, so we will go like a little bit each of us. Ahí les dije que vamos a ir un poquito cada una mientras vos vas hablando, vas contando por parte, de partes medio cortas, entonces yo voy traduciendo y seguimos.
Bueno, con respecto a Argentina, a la educación de derechos humanos, no existe en el diseño curricular ni de Nación ni de la provincia de Córdoba, donde yo trabajo, los derechos humanos como sí. Se trabaja sobre derechos del niño.
She's saying that it doesn't exist in Argentina as a subject separated, the teaching of the human rights, like as a technical thing, but they focus on teaching because of the Ministry of Education. They make it compulsory to teach about the child rights. So they focus on that, and from there they take it to make it wider.
Tenemos fechas especiales, como por ejemplo el 24 de marzo, que en Argentina se recuerda el Día de la Memoria, Verdad y Justicia, donde se trabaja en la escuela con los grados más altos, cuarto, quinto y sexto grado, en aulas taller, donde ahí sí salen casos sobre derechos humanos y sí se trabaja. También hacemos aulas taller sobre prevención de cáncer de mama, con salida a la comunidad y sobre violencia de género. Salimos a la comunidad a concientizar.
So she's saying that what they try to do as a main point, what's like the main development of human rights, it would be like teaching in workshops where they combine the last three grades of primary school. It's 4th, 5th, and 6th. In here is like from 9, 10 to 12, 13 years. And they combine one main workshop based on some 4 special occasions during the year. One, which is the wider, is the 24th of March, where it's the commemoration of the dictatorship in here. Then they do the rights of the child. Then they do non-violence, because of the day of non-violence, and then they do breast cancer awareness day here. Like in Argentina, there is a huge public campaign regarding that every year, so they try to focus on some issues from there on.
Y con respecto a los derechos humanos, se da siempre inclinado hacia los derechos del niño en las situaciones cotidianas que surgen de problemas de convivencia dentro de la institución, como estudiantes.
And then they do, they try to, as it's not a different subject to study for them compulsory, so they try to make it transversal during all the year and work with some daily situations as diversity, as sexual education, as the rights of the child, and they combine with, for instance, well, she didn't say this, but this is an example. From the hospitals, they work on vaccination and those kind of stuff.
Lo que también es importante y recordamos es la fecha del 12 de octubre, que es el Día de la Diversidad Cultural, y ahí también trabajamos sobre derechos humanos puntuales. También se recuerda como derechos del niño la vacunación obligatoria y gratuita en colaboración con el Hospital Municipal. Se tiene mucho en cuenta los derechos del niño en nuestra educación.
And she's saying that at the last note, they do another big workshop with the 3 grades regarding diversity, cultural diversity. We kind of not celebrate, but try to work on that during October, because the 12th of October is the commemoration of the arrival of Cristobal Colon to the Americas. So that has a lot of issues in between, so they try to do some big workshops to teach about diversity and human rights, basic rules during these months. Currently, we are actually working on that. And then she mentioned the hospital vaccination. Here is compulsory and it's free for the health, like it's a national rule. So they work a lot with hospitals regarding that.
Nos están surgiendo, como en nuestro pueblo es pequeño, nos están surgiendo algunos problemas de convivencia con respecto a las diferentes creencias religiosas, que las estamos tratando también como derechos, que cada uno tiene derechos, y por ahí a los chicos les resulta difícil por ser una comunidad pequeña y muy católica por sí. Pero ahora se está respetando eso también y los chicos muy amablemente lo respetan.
Pepa, después digo la parte más de desafíos cuando nos hagan la segunda pregunta. Menciono medio general ahora nomás. She was trying to mention that they are starting to work as well, but we will focus then on the challenges as well in that, regarding interfaith education and religious co-living.
Great, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Let's go
Gracias.
next to Olivera in Bosnia. Welcome, Olivera.
Hello, Kim and everybody else, panelists and all our participants. Thank you for participating in this really important subject and topic. Well, I will say that I feel really privileged to be a civic educator, a civic education teacher in Bosnia. And I have to say that probably this is the one field where Bosnia stands, let me say, ahead of other countries like Serbia, Croatia, or Montenegro, because we are the only country in Balkans which has compulsory subject, within our curriculum. And somehow I'm very proud of that achievement. It's also much related to Institute Center for Democracy, who helped development with our pedagogical institution, that civic education actually becomes valid subject within our official curriculum. I think cross-curricular approach is very important and significant, and it has to be implemented in each and every education system. But if you have compulsory subjects, then you have person who is investing in development of the subject and like trying to bring that entire concept to a higher level. How it looks like in our country, this is something that is unique for the entire country. That the primary school students, they all have democracy and human rights, civic education. It's only, it varies on which level they have it. Sometimes it's 6th graders and sometimes it's like 9th graders. It depends which part of Bosnia we are talking about. But the content is the same. We speak about justice, authority, responsibility, diversity. But what I'm mostly proud of is Project Citizen. And it's something that gives opportunity to teachers to teach civic education in a very practical way. Students choose problem, the topic that some right, human right that is violated in their surrounding or that is not implemented on a very high level, on the level that it should be implemented. And then they work on those topics. They are always advised to choose topics that they can solve during one school year or during their education period while they stand in a say in the primary school. So what is amazing is that we try to make them really truly participate. They go to authorities where the decision making process is taking place. They speak about their problem. They ask questions. For example, they visit offices of mayor, which is like, you know, it wasn't really common until we had this human rights and democracy, that they can go to such in their vision important position making persons. So they go there with their questions, and the best thing is when they actually succeed in the change that they tried to make. For example, in one city, in one town, actually in Bosnia, the students discovered that in that city they don't have pediatric services. They don't have a doctor that is specialized for children, for the pediatric specialist. So they wrote letters to the ministries of health. Then they talked to the mayor, and they in a very short time period they managed to change that. So the what I'm trying to do, how it looks like in my classroom, they are full active. They are active all the time. They play roles. They do simulations. For example, they have one chapter, one module that is devoted to the selection process of persons who come to be mayors. So they play roles. We have 3 candidates, and then also we have voters, and we learn what kind of virtues, what kind of characteristics, qualifications should the person have who they will choose. And what I'm trying personally to make them, I try to build their self-confidence. I try to convince them, to make them believe that they can influence their surrounding, that they don't need to wait until their hair turns gray, how their parents thought, or generation of my parents thought. It's just the communistic and socialistic way of leading country affected the citizens in a way that they didn't have confidence that they can change things. So I try from the moment we meet in the classroom till they finish with that level of education, that they that they influence at least one important decision in their city or in their school, and that they are active participants, and that they are actively involved in the process all the way through. So I try to, I don't know if I managed, but I try to make it, let me say, close to the way we work in our schools. And about challenges, I will talk in the next part. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Olivera. That was great. Let's go to Thea next.
Sorry, did you?
No,
I'm unmuted now.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm so appreciative of being here today to talk with you about the work that I do with students in the US. And so I think the focus, and to sort of connect to the points that you were making, Oliviera, is just to really have students at the center of our work and thinking about how they can shape the world that they live in. What can we do to help amplify their voices, their experiences, and as adults to really focus on providing tools and resources so that way young people eventually no longer need us, right? Like, we want to be on the side. We want them to know how to find the answers to their questions and to know that they have a sense of agency and ability to take their concerns about whether it's their classroom or their school or their community or their state or their nation, and think about what changes would they like to see so that the world is more just. And then give them the tools to think about, with all their background knowledge, how can they then make change? How can they build coalitions with others? How can they partner with groups and like-minded people to advocate around a particular issue and then evaluate the impact that they've had? And so for me at a secondary level, which would be like your 14 through 18-year-old students, a lot of that work is framed in first learning about student interests and why they're interested in human rights and what would they like to see the world look like as they grow into adulthood. And I love the point that was made earlier about focusing on that young people don't need to be sort of adults or grown up or have to wait to start to amplify their own voices and think about changes they'd like to see. So for me, it's always about engaging young people first in the complex work of learning about historical issues, whether they're atrocities, and then thinking about what are the contemporary issues that they can apply that background knowledge to, and then move forward with their own thinking and what they'd like to see. And so my course starts with surveying students. What are their interests? Why did they take the course? What do they hope to learn? And we talk a lot about media because I feel particularly today, like media literacy, news literacy, where we get our information and whether that information is verifiable, is it fact-based? Perhaps there are unproven claims in it because it has a strong influence on what we understand to be true and not true. And so helping students develop that skill of being a critical news consumer, or a critical media consumer, and also a responsible media creator. We talk a lot about this beautiful TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie, which is about the single story or the dangers of a single story and how the way that we perceive people that we believe to be different from ourselves and our earliest messages about people we believe to be different from ourselves are often incomplete. And yet they have a lot of power because they influence what we believe. And so talking about how we challenge stereotypes and why that's important to our work as human rights advocates. And then we also focus on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that really is the underpinning for the work that I do with students, because it allows us to take a look at how did we get to the point where as a global community, we have this document. And we know it doesn't have the force of law, but it is sort of a guiding post for what we'd like to see the world to look like, that every person, regardless of where they're born, has these opportunities and these guarantees from their government. And we talk about that in terms of our lens for looking at both domestic issues in the United States and also international areas of concern. But it gives us an underpinning and a way to frame how do we go about this work? What does it look like? And then what are the economic or security issues or social pressures that influence how governments respond when there is a violation of human rights, whether it's in their country or outside of their borders? And so I think my goal is always to focus on framing the role of active citizens, right? So all the changes that have happened in the world, much of it has come through people demanding that their governments take action. And so where can we look to models historically for how that's happened, and then look at contemporary areas and needs, right? And so even though it might mean writing letters to government officials as a starting point, what are the other ways in which the people, citizenry, can pressure government to change its decision, to do something different, and to influence what happens? And so I think that helps young people see themselves as active participants, that they're not passive, that they can sort of take the reins and shape what the future of their country looks like. And so some of the topics that we talk about regarding the United States are economic justice. What does that look like? Looking at racial justice, environmental justice as well. So thinking about climate and how our decisions impact other countries, as well as looking at climate issues and justice in our own communities. Women's rights, so looking at gender equity, LGBTQ equality, and then civic engagement, which really does frame much of our work, and talking about immigration. And then finally, news and media literacy and how that helps us be active and engaged citizens that can make decisions both at the ballot box, but also about the things that are happening in our own neighborhoods and feel empowered to make changes where we see that they're needed. And so my goal is to promote value and respect for the dignity of others and a sense of agency for kids to speak out and engage in civic activities that help to lead to a more just society.
Great, thank you so much, Thea.
Sure.
Britta.
All right, so that kind of transitions perfectly. I love that we brought up danger of a single story, and I'm going to talk a little about that. When I think about human rights in my classroom, a lot of times it has to be grounded in identity work. I realize that students need to be able to recognize and honor their own humanity before they're going to be able to recognize and honor the humanity of others. And unfortunately, in any society, there's this hidden curriculum where we're taught that certain parts of ourselves are not valid or don't have a right to exist. And if we can't identify those stories that we've internalized, then we can't kind of pull apart the stories that we've externalized and placed onto others. So when I start my year, this first looks like an identity web where students start to talk about intersectionality and that moment where all of your identities intersect. And what does that mean? So a lot of these things are pieces that they've never thought about before. It's just kind of been there. So giving them time to look at not only what are parts of their identities that they chose and what are parts of their identities that they may not have given much thought to, but are definitely there, that are products of their circumstances or the environment or the people in their lives, the stakeholders who are raising them. Then it's this idea of reflecting on those parts of their web. So figuring out what are the parts of our webs that are setting us up to thrive? So for myself, what sets me up to thrive? In the United States, my skin, my race sets me up to thrive. It's not anything that is overlooked versus what are the parts of your identity that may be overlooked, right? What are the parts of your identity that for some reason seem to cause a barrier for you to success, not because of that part, but because of society and kind of the norms that have been created. What are the parts that we value most? What are the things that are important to us? What are the things we wish we knew about? So this is really time for students to reflect in a really messy way of like, okay, here are all the things that might be in my identity, and kind of pushing them a little to think about what are the parts I chose? What are the parts that were chosen for me? And so it's this really interesting moment where you have discussions with students then about what are socially constructed parts of your identity? How is race socially constructed and what we think it means? How is gender socially constructed? And you can have these conversations with an 8th grader who's 13, and it's wonderful to watch them process kind of what that means. So once they have this complex web of all the things that they feel make them who they are or play a part in who they are, if you bring in Chimamanda's idea of the single story, you go to their web and you say, this is you. And you point to one part of it. And it's very clear to them that's not them. And usually you choose a part that they probably didn't mark as their most important part. But you say, no, that's you. This is your story. And then you ask kids, okay, well, why? What's the problem? What is the danger in that single story? What is the danger in that single story? And this year I had a young 8th grade boy who's 13 who is not very mature. And then he looked at me when I did that with his web and he said, well, that demeans the rest of who I am. And then I looked at him and he was also shocked that that came out of him. And so I think it's this idea of, depending on the population you work with, when I'm working with students who are predominantly middle class and white in America, they have not had to think about the parts of their identity that may not set them up to thrive, because most of the parts of their identity set them up for success here. And so when they really think it through and that potential of being limited to only one part is put in their face, that is a really eye-opening experience. And that's very different than if I'm working with new Americans like I did at the high school, who could very easily talk about race like it was nothing, versus if you talk to a young white American, to say that they're white puts them on edge. That makes them deeply uncomfortable. So these stories, we bring different pieces to every conversation we have, and what we're willing to talk about, not talk about, shows us what we've learned from the country and the elders who have been kind of bringing us through. So the identity work needs to be critical and it needs to be reflective. It can also be fun because we don't want students to think that their identities are just this source of just critical sadness and struggle, right? Because we're all of those parts. So it might be creative writing prompts, looking to authors who look like them or experience their experiences and have stories of joy and struggle. I found that once you build the personal foundation, then you can broaden the lens. So once a student can recognize their humanity, they can see all the facets that go into who they are and that each one plays a role and they maybe didn't choose all of those. Then you can broaden it to look at the identity of someone else. That's when they can no longer limit that person to say, oh, they were this. They have to look at the bigger picture. And it could be a historical person. It could be the identity web for an entire country. So if you create an identity web, and I can speak for America, the American point of view, that becomes quite complicated. Now, we can't just focus on this one story, maybe that is being advocated by our current government of the story of freedom, but it also needs to be more than the single story because that can be dangerous. Then we overlook the struggles, the people who have been oppressed for the freedom of others. We overlook how privilege was established. So really grounding our work in individual identity helps my students see the humanity, the individual and collective humanity in others, in other countries, in other people, in other time periods. Because in the end, we're all humans, but we forget that really simple phrase because it's so easy to buy into those single stories. Once you've got that foundation, you can always come back to it. You can always ground them and you can red flag them when they're falling into that trap. And then you can dive into Indigenous rights, LGBTQ rights, civil rights, as well as events like the Holocaust and other genocides, because they're rooted in humanity, both individual and collective. So I really try and ground it in that individual work. And then when we get to that large scale of a genocide where it can be very overwhelming, working to ground those in individual actions too. So considering the pyramid of hate created by the American Defamation League, where it talks about genocides at the top, but how do we get there? Because once again, it's those individual actions on a small scale that can lead to mass atrocities on a large scale. So rooting everything in the individual, but then also connecting it to the collective, I think is the greatest thing we can do as educators to teach students to not only honor their own humanity, but to see the humanity in other populations.
Thank you, Britta. That was a great segue between your and Thea's comments. So next we want to talk to everybody about some of the obstacles that you've faced in teaching human rights issues, whether it's, you know, at your schools, with your principals, with your students, even with parents. And if everybody would just continue to put your questions and comments in the chat box, it's a really good conversation going on there as well. So Antonella, let's start with you and Alicia this time. What are some of the obstacles that your mom has faced in this human rights education?
Ok, Ma dice que bueno, que empecemos nosotras con esto, cuáles son los desafíos a nivel como vos en el aula, con los chicos, con las autoridades, con la comunidad, lo que se te ocurra.
Nosotros tenemos un equipo de trabajo muy bueno, donde nos apoyamos unas a otras, y la directora continuamente está apoyándonos en la enseñanza y en los desafíos que se nos presentan el día a día. Nosotros tenemos hace pocos años una ley de educación sexual integral, ESI, que la estamos implementando en la escuela con ayuda de médicos, nosotros haciendo cursos para reinventarnos en todo esto, y está dando muy buenos resultados porque ahí es donde y la integridad de ellos. Bueno, al principio hubo algunos que otros desafíos que enfrentar, como por ejemplo los papás, las dudas de los papás sobre cómo se iba a trabajar esto, qué temas se iban a tratar, porque parecían temas muy tabú, y no es así. A los chicos les encanta enterarse, les encanta saber de qué se trata su propio cuerpo, el cuidado de su propio cuerpo, la integridad, el decir hasta acá, este soy yo. Entonces empezaron a hacer reuniones con los padres de los estudiantes para explicarles qué temas, inclusive hasta les hemos hablado y pasado videos sobre eso para que ellos se enteren y se queden tranquilos, que nosotros les vamos a enseñar a los estudiantes siempre cuidándolos. Y ahí salen unos debates preciosos de parte de ellos que los dejamos ser libres de expresión y la verdad salen resultados exitosos.
So she's saying that to face all the challenges of a small town and a province which is not the biggest in the country and everything, and the lack of resources, of course, they have a huge team of teachers and the principal is super supportive. They have they are friends most of all, so it's really easy to work with people like that because they socialize the risks and the problems all the time. One of the main challenges she's mentioning is that we have a national law to teach integral sexual education for many years now here in all the public schools at every level. And it's really challenging to teach it because you need to start with the foundations of dignity and humanity and then go to the basics of the sexual education. And it's really challenging so far because there are a lot of families who approach a school and they need to kind of know how the teachers are going to teach that, and they want to take the students out of the school because they don't want them to have some kind of bias training. So it's really challenging so far, but they are trying to, the ministry is supporting them a lot now with new courses and resources. So they are trying to teach themselves and train themselves as much as they can to face the families and to, to have like parallel meetings with the parents to socialize the materials from like ahead of the trainings for the students so they can start having those basics rules.
Thank you. Thea, let's go to you next.
So one of the challenges that I feel are just very common to education in the US, particularly around historical and contemporary issues that are complex, right, is time. Like how much time do teachers have within that school year to fully develop a curriculum and to ensure that students have a deep understanding of these issues, which are often multi-layered and faceted, so that way students don't walk away with misconceptions or gaps in their understanding or a sense of a human rights issue that reduces people to just a series of numbers or a series of tragedies, right? And so helping students have a fuller understanding of the humanity of the people that we are talking about when we talk about human rights violations. And so I think specifically recognizing that it's important to teach about resistance and the activism of the groups of people that we want students to understand. So when I think about teaching about the Holocaust, and so again, reminding students of the activism, of the work in which people resisted, so that way students don't walk away with these misconceptions. And I can make the same parallel in terms of talking about the teaching of any topics around Native American history, even just understanding Indigenous Peoples Day. And so helping students have a more complex or complete understanding of human rights violations, but also of the advocacy and the work and the resistance and activism of people who were impacted directly. So teaching people not as victims, but as individuals who had lives, and these are the things that they did and how they fought back. I think that that's really important in terms of not just admiring the problem. And so I think when it comes to time, teachers sometimes feel that pressure to cover content, right? To just move on very quickly But I think in the end, we have to really think about how do we do a deep dive so that way students understand the role of the individual, the value of the lives of people they're learning about, and that the importance of speaking up when they are able to. So I feel that that's one of the things to just sort of keep in mind. I think the other thing that's difficult is what to teach in terms of how to prioritize. And that's also a time-based question that's unique to each teacher, their department, their community. And just, I think it's a challenging thing for educators to do in isolation. And so when you do have some guidance, like in New York, we have guidance in terms of state standards, it helps. But I think those are two things that I find myself and other educators that I work with thinking a lot about, like how do we do a good job, a thorough job, but also how do we decide what to prioritize? And that's hard because there's so many important things we want kids to know.
Exactly, and I think that is a global issue for sure. Thank you. Albert, what about you? What are some of the difficulties you've had in this kind of education?
Thank you, Kim. Some obstacles we face in teaching human rights topics. Human rights education is a good topic that anyone would be interested in as he or she get to know his rights, but there is always a hindrance. Some of the obstacles are like balancing the diverse learning needs. Different students or people will reach out to have different needs. As an education to human rights, which involves many areas, as there are different type of rights, everyone come with his expectation, and we can't meet very single needs to everyone in the room. There is no takeaway from the lesson delivered. Another thing is the lack of proper funding. Going to teach people requires some expense, like to place together people, to chat or material to facilitate learning, or other expense that come with training and reaching out to people. Another challenge is about people with different wounds. Some take time to understand others, and is for us as a teacher our duty to make that we offer has the positive impact to people's lives. And for instance, here in Rwanda, most people have the wounds caused by 1984 genocide against Tutsis. And it is somehow challenging to teach such people because they are still struggling to get healed from the wounds caused by genocide.
Thank you, Albert. Let's go next to Britta.
I think there are a variety of struggles. I think small scale, large scale. When Thea was speaking, it made me think of this concern of even the single story that we present sometimes as educators. So when we're bringing into any classroom, any sort of text, if it deals with the trauma of a specific group, how else have we counteracted that text? Have we introduced students to that group or identity with stories of joy and success and innovation? Or is that the one and only story that we share? I think with the Holocaust, a lot of times that tends to be a student's first introduction for individuals of the Jewish faith. And we know that the Holocaust included so many more pieces, right? But a lot of times then for students, they hear Jewish, and that is one of the first things that comes to mind. And so how are we, using the limited time we have to create this complicated picture, to create these full humans who are more than just their trauma, right? That is one part of an experience that went into their identity, but they were a full human before and after that trauma. And that is just one piece of the puzzle. So I think that becomes really complicated to find those texts and those pieces and to make time for them. While at the same time, I think that if you're going to dive into a discussion on collective trauma, then I think we need to also bring in collective joy and successes. And I think those need to be the ones brought in first. Because if the first introduction to those topics tends to be what sticks, right? Those first impressions. I think another struggle currently would be the political climate, especially in the US, but I know we see it in other countries around the world. it's really difficult. There are a lot of policies in place to ensure in the state that I work in, we do not have the right to protest as educators. You have to be really mindful of what you do and do not say in a classroom. And that follows that really tricky line of neutrality. And we know as human rights educators the dangers of neutrality. And so walking that fine line of not endorsing maybe a political party, but also not endorsing human rights violations and things that we know are fundamentally wrong, and that those within these fields of study know as signs, right, of red flags. We know those signposts, and yet we're kind of being muzzled or censored, and it's really, really difficult. And I find that students struggle with that as well. The other big challenge I see is an overwhelming pessimism. I think a lot of times groups that are working to suppress votes, to suppress rights, they succeed because they encourage pessimism. They encourage people to think nothing will change and this is how it's always going to be. I know I hear it with my students. What am I going to do? I'm not going to make a difference there, right? And so making things manageable for students so that, yes, it's a big issue, but also how does it start? It starts with those small things. And it reminds me of Brittany Packnett Cunningham is an activist and author, and she wrote recently affirmations for times of crises, I believe. And she said, I choose the discipline of hope over the ease of cynicism. And so this idea of how do we teach our students the discipline of hope amidst reading past atrocities, connecting them to current circumstances, how do we teach them that discipline to always look for the helpers, to, continue to push? So I think for me, there's a multitude of struggles. There's teaching kids a discipline of hope, honoring the traumas that are there, and also giving narratives of joy, and just making sure what we bring into the classroom will lead our students to become those independent change makers that we want them to become. We don't want them to be paralyzed by the enormity of the struggles.
And I think that goes along really well, that recommendation of the book, to something that was just a chat comment about students having difficulty sometimes finding that joy. So thank you. Olivera, let's go to you next.
Thank you. Well, I tried to group obstacles, or let me say categorize it in two groups. The first group is related to awareness about the concept of democracy in the classroom itself. So when we are speaking about Bosnia, we are talking about people, citizens who didn't really have a lot of contact in the past with participative democracy. So they kind of question it themselves. The parents question the importance of the subject, the sense of that subject. In the beginning, it was obstacle. Let me say, it was challenge to introduce it in a proper way. That it's a really important competence. That it's one of 8 on the European education scale. So that we need to bring it into our classrooms. If we don't do that in the primary school level, we are late then. We will lose those generations who will not learn how to participate. So it was really important to explain that it's important as math, as languages, literature, any other subject. That was the first, let me say, goal that I set as educator, to convince my colleagues that it's really important to and then to also convince parents, and then of course I will work with students, and that I will try to make them interested in it. The other group, yes, I will mention also the atmosphere in our country, where we have nationalistic leaders who, for 2 decades, bring bad decisions. So the politics itself is considered as something really bad by the people, by the population. So another challenge for me is to explain that politics is not bad itself. It's very important. It's just the people who get involved there, so that we should choose the best people, that we should encourage people to participate. That was one part of obstacle. The other part is technical, let me say, administrative nature. For example, my first principle, I must say that right now it's not the case. I have supportive principals who are really interested in what I do in my classroom. But at that very beginning, so we are talking about period 12 years ago, when we started with democracy in the classrooms on the level of primary school. For example, when I would work on Project Citizens with my students, and I would encourage them to be totally free to choose subjects from any spectrum. So they would choose, for example, illegal construction of objects in our place, in our town. So the principal was very concerned, like Olivera, that is very problematic. Don't do that. They will make me guilty for like speaking about. So, I mean, it was very challenging to make to speak about certain subjects, although we thought it's necessary to make. I mean, if we limit them, students, in selection of problems, then it's not democracy. How can I teach democracy and say those are forbidden topics, those are taboo topics, and you cannot do? So I had to really I put a lot of efforts in struggle with him with at that time, because I didn't want to limit students in choosing any subjects they think. It's, of course, we always check constitution if it's all in the frame of the topic that we can deal with their age and everything. So somehow we managed to do that, to overcome that obstacle. And then also the other thing is we use a lot of theory in the classrooms still, and that is not really convincing for students. You know, if I'm a teacher who only talks how they should do, and in the same time I just stand there behind the cathedra and do nothing about it. So I decided at that time, and I really own to my profession why I became so active person in my community. I started leading an NGO who tackled many topics, who started from problem and then constructing public policies that we try to enforce and make it obligatory for some certain of level of decision makers. And when I do that, for example, I speak about initiatives in the classroom and the various ways how the students can participate. And then they see their teacher who organized some initiative that invites public to sign as a petition, or to, whether it's like reduction of price for electricity or any other form of participation. And then they had different sense of what I'm talking in the classroom. Then they started to believe actually in that. So I would say it was a process, you know, the process where I was very passionate about, and I tried to do my best. And now when I look backwards, I see the effect. I see some of my students that are very active in the community, and they still remember the methodology, the pattern that they learned in the classroom, and somehow that makes me believe that I'm on the right way as educator.
Thank you, Olivera. That's what we all want, isn't it? And last but not least, I'd like to go to Amabla to answer that same question. Amabla?
Yes, thank you, Kim. So I think teaching human rights has to be very practical, such that the students take actions and be able to protect their own rights, but importantly, see why they can't infringe upon others' rights. And in order to be there, pedagogy has to be all the time effective and very engaging. And you have to help students to develop their attitudes, knowledge, and analytical skills. So all this require well, high level of preparation, and very unfortunately, we don't have enough resources in my context in order to come up with a professional, proper lesson plan when you want to teach about human rights. So that's a serious challenge that I've been confronting throughout my career. And I'm very sure that's the same challenge other colleagues have been confronting again. So I've been, after realizing that challenge, I've committed myself to work on, to compile different lesson plans that I can share with the teachers. So if you think where you come from, teachers face the same challenge. So you are free to collaborate with me on this particular project. So another big challenge is that professional opportunities to teachers, professional workshops that teachers have to attend, they are very rare, and where they are very limited in terms of content and the time. So if teachers don't attend the professional development sessions, if teachers don't have enough resources, or those resources they have don't match with their own context, it becomes very hard to teach properly about human rights. It becomes very difficult to support your students to learn more about human rights, such that they can be able to protect their own rights and others as well.
Thank you. Well said, Amabla. Well, thank you, everybody. I'd love to thank all of the participants on the panel today. This was fascinating. I wrote down a lot of notes and learned a lot as well, and I hope that all of our participants did too. It was recorded. If anybody is interested, we will have that on our website later at eihr.org. And again, we just appreciate everybody's participation today. Thank you so much.